So in 1675, King Charles II of England sat down and drafted this royal proclamation to completely ban a dark, bitter liquid that had just arrived in his kingdom.
Which is just, I mean, it's such a bizarre historical moment.
Right, and he wasn't banning it because it was toxic or anything like that. He was banning it because he was absolutely terrified of what happens when sober, highly stimulated people sit in a room together and just, well, talk.
Yeah, the thread of conversation.
Exactly. And today, you probably paid like $5 for that exact same liquid on your way to work, completely unaware that you were drinking a beverage that once genuinely threatened to topple the British monarchy.
It's wild. And, you know, the irony of history is that the objects that possess the absolute most power over us are often the ones we just, we stop looking at entirely.
They've just become invisible.
Exactly. We are so conditioned to view human civilization through this lens of macro events, right? Like the traditional historical narrative is basically just a highlight reel. It's grand treaties, collapsing empires, and, you know, battles fought by guys in powdered wigs.
It's history carved in marble.
Yes, beautifully put. But the true architecture of human behavior, like the actual forces that dictate how we move and think and interact every single day, they are completely invisible. I mean, they're literally sitting in your junk drawer right now. They're the fasteners on your jacket. They are the utensils resting next to your plate.
Which is basically the fundamental mission of our deep dives into the sources today. We are pulling from this incredibly diverse stack of material. We've got archives from the Science History Institute. We have these dense sociological frameworks from Michel de Certeau and Pierre Bourdieu, and these massive historical encyclopedias of domestic life.
It's a really rich stack of sources.
It really is. And the goal here is to just completely invert your perspective. We are shifting away from that macro history of the 1%, the kings and generals, and we're exploring the micro history of the 99%.
And, you know, this shift in perspective is actually a relatively modern development in historiography. For centuries, the academic establishment just suffered from this profound bias toward the great man theory of history.
Right, where history is only driven by a few important dudes.
Exactly. The daily survival mechanisms of ordinary people were just dismissed. They called it peasant trivia or women's work, which was considered entirely beneath the dignity of serious scholarship.
Which is just so arrogant in retrospect.
Oh, completely. And the turning point really didn't arrive until after the First World War. Around 1918, you have these historians, Marjorie and C.H.B. Quesnel, and they began publishing this monumental series called A History of Everyday Things in England.
I love that title.
It's perfect, right? And they systematically just bypassed all the battlefields to examine housing and agriculture, sanitation, domestic tools. They basically demonstrated that the most profound revolutions in human society, they don't announce themselves with cannon fire. They slip into our lives disguised as convenience.
Disguised as convenience. Wow, that hits hard. And I actually want to start our exploration in the room where the most intimate form of that convenience takes place, which is the kitchen.
Oh, the kitchen is fascinating.
It is. Going through these historical records of domestic life, the kitchen operates as this almost brutal laboratory for human evolution. And the perfect entry point into that laboratory is an object that caused a massive theological uproar, the fork.
The humble fork.
Right. Today, it's just the thing you use to eat a salad. But the fork has an incredibly dramatic, almost scandalous origin story.
It really does. The controversy surrounding the fork is this fascinating study in moral panic. To trace the modern fork, we have to look all the way back to the 7th century Byzantine Empire.
Okay, so quite a while ago.
Right, and at that time, it was a very specialized two-pronged tool. It was primarily reserved for carving or serving meat. It was not an implement for individual dining.
You were bringing it to your mouth.
Exactly. The societal rupture happens later in the 11th century, when a Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropoulina marries into the Venetian court, and she brings her personal golden two-pronged forks with her to Venice. And she actually uses them at these fancy aristocratic banquets.
And instead of the Venetians marveling at this great hygienic innovation, they treat her like she just committed heresy right at the dinner table.
Oh, the backlash was immediate and visceral. The local clergy, particularly figures like St. Peter Damian, openly condemned the princess. I mean, they didn't just find the fork pretentious, they viewed it as a profound theological offense.
Because God gave us hands.
Exactly. The argument was rooted in this deep belief that God had provided human beings with the ultimate divinely engineered tools for interacting with the world, which are our fingers.
Right.
The aristocratic standard of the time was the three-finger rule. So polite society ate using only the thumb, index, and middle fingers, and you had to keep the ring and pinky fingers pristine. So to introduce an artificial metallic intermediary between God's bounty and the human mouth, that was viewed as an outright rejection of divine design. It was basically the sin of hubris materialized in gold.
The medieval logic there is just wild to consider today. It's essentially the 11th century equivalent of like letting an artificial intelligence write your personal wedding vows.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. People thought it was cheating. It was viewed as this unnatural technological intervention that alienated humanity from the authentic experience of the physical world.
That analogy perfectly captures the anxiety of the era. The fork was an unnatural barrier, and because of this intense moral panic, the adoption of the fork stalled for centuries in Europe. I mean, centuries. It wasn't until the Renaissance, and really moving into the 18th century, that the fork finally overcame its sinful reputation.
Wow.
And during that long transition, the tool actually had to undergo a necessary piece of engineering evolution, because the two-pronged Byzantine model was really highly effective for spearing a slice of roasted meat, but it was functionally useless for the varied diets of later centuries.
Yeah, I mean, you can't eat a plate of peas with a two-pronged spear.
No, you'd be there all night. The physical mechanics demanded an upgrade. So the introduction of the third, and eventually the fourth time, provided the surface area and the curvature necessary to actually scoop loose foods.
It turned it into a scoop.
Exactly. It transformed the fork from a specialized carving spike into the ultimate culinary multi-tool. It eliminated the need to constantly switch between a spoon for your vegetables and a knife for your meat.
So convenient.
Very. But the journey of the fork, going from this condemned luxury that insulted the creator down to an entirely invisible piece of everyday flatware, it just illustrates how deeply moral weight is attached to new technologies before they finally fade into the background of daily life.
Yeah, that is so true. And while society was, slowly adapting to the morality of metallic eating utensils, a much more volatile revolution was brewing in the cups right next to those plates.
Yes.
Which brings us back to that King Charles II ban I mentioned earlier. Coffee. The sources point to coffee as perhaps the single most influential substance in the entire rewiring of modern human civilization.
The trajectory of coffee is remarkable. It begins with this famous Ethiopian legend of the goat herder, Kaldi. He supposedly observed his flock becoming hyperactive after they consumed the red cherries of the coffee plant.
The goats discovered coffee.
I love that. It's a great origin myth. And from the Ethiopian highlands, the practice of brewing these beans moved through Sufi monasteries in Yemen. They utilized it to maintain alertness during these really prolonged religious rituals. So it deeply integrated into the Islamic world before it finally penetrated European society in the 17th century.
And its arrival in Europe is just explosive.
Oh, it caused a fundamental shift in human cognitive capacity.
Well, let's contextualize the European baseline before coffee even arrives.
Yeah.
Because the municipal water supplies in the 1600s were essentially petri dishes.
That's putting it mildly.
Right. Like drinking plain water in London or Paris was a massive health risk.
It was a literal gamble with dysentery or cholera every time you took a sip. Consequently, the standard daytime beverage across all age groups and all classes was small beer or a weak ale. The fermentation process killed the pathogens, making it safer than water.
Which makes sense from a survival standpoint.
It does. But the unavoidable side effect was that the entire European workforce, from the agrarian laborers all the way up to the university scholars, was basically operating on a low-grade depressant from dawn until dusk.
Just a continent of people who were slightly buzzed all day.
The collective consciousness of Europe was perpetually sedated, and then suddenly, coffee is introduced, this potent central nervous system stimulant.
Boom. Wake up.
Exactly. But the sociological impact wasn't just the caffeine itself, it was the specific environment where that caffeine was consumed.
The coffee house. The institutions that eventually earned the nickname penny universities.
Yes, the structure in the 17th century coffee house was entirely novel. Unlike a tavern, which was, dark and rowdy and fueled by alcohol, the coffee house was well lit and fueled by stimulants.
Totally different vibe.
Completely. And more importantly, the physical layout promoted egalitarian discourse. There were these long communal tables. For the price of a single penny, A patron received a cup of coffee and the right to sit at that table, where a wealthy merchant might be seated directly next to a shoemaker or a playwright.
Anyone could just pull up a chair.
Exactly. And the penny also covered access to the latest printed newsletters and gazettes that were scattered around the room.
So you have this combination of caffeine, reading material, and forced proximity across class lines. That is a recipe for an intellectual explosion. You are taking a population that used to drink beer in segregated taverns and putting them in a highly stimulated cross-class reading room.
Which is exactly why the modern financial and scientific worlds were literally incubated in these spaces. I mean, the London Stock Exchange originated as Jonathan's Coffee House, where merchants just started posting commodity prices on the wall. Yeah. And the massive global insurance market, Lloyd's of London, that began in Edward Lloyd's Coffee House on Tower Street. It was just a popular gathering spot for sailors and ship owners sharing maritime intelligence.
That is amazing.
Even the Royal Society, the absolute cornerstone of modern scientific inquiry, they frequently met in coffee houses to debate physics and dissect marine life.
See, this totally explains the panic of King Charles II. When you empower the public with rapid communication and clear-headedness, and a space where social hierarchies just break down, the ruling class loses its monopoly on information.
The threat to the monarchy was very tangible. Charles II's 1675 proclamation explicitly stated that coffee houses were places where malicious and scandalous reports were devised against the crown.
He knew what was up.
He absolutely did. He recognized that a sober, highly caffeinated public debating the news of the day inevitably begins to question authority and demand political agency. But the public backlash to his ban was so severe that the king was actually forced to withdraw the proclamation within just a few days.
Wow. The people demanded their coffee.
They did. The everyday object, in this case a brewed beverage, proved more powerful than a royal decree.
That is just incredible. But moving from the dining table and the coffee house into the actual mechanics of the kitchen, the historical archives reveal a reality that is far less philosophical and far more terrifying.
Very terrifying.
The evolution of the pots and pans used to boil that coffee or cook that food, it's an exhausting chronicle of trial, error, and literal poison. Reading through this, cooking in the pre-industrial era sounds less like domestic science and more like a high-stakes survival game.
The chemical realities of early cookware were incredibly hostile. For centuries, the most accessible material for pots and bowls was earthenware. But the fundamental flaw of earthenware is its porosity. It absorbs liquids.
Right, like a sponge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to make a clay pot functional for boiling stews or holding wine, it had to be sealed with a glaze. The tragedy of pre-industrial ceramics is that the most effective, durable, and visually appealing glazes were achieved using lead oxide.
We now know that lead is a devastating neurotoxin. But they were using it to coat the vessels holding their family's daily meals.
And the danger was compounded by the ingredients they were cooking. If a household prepared anything highly acidic, like a tomato-based stew or vinegar or wine, the acid would initiate a chemical reaction that leached the lead directly out of the glaze and into the food.
Oh, that's horrifying.
It really is.
Yeah.
The cumulative neurotoxic effects on generations of people are staggering to consider. The danger was so pervasive that even into the early 20th century, domestic science pioneers were forced to devise workarounds. There's this prominent figure in the home economics movement, Martha Van Rensselaer, and she documented a rudimentary chemistry test for housewives.
What did they have to do?
She advised women to crack a raw egg into a new earthenware pot, beat it, and leave it for a few minutes.
Because the sulfur in the egg yolk reacts with the lead.
Precisely. If the glaze contained active, leachable lead, the hydrogen sulfide from the egg would react with it to form lead sulfide, which is black. So if the egg mixture discolored, the housewife instantly knew the pot was actively poisoning her family and had to be discarded. It was an impromptu toxicology screen performed right before dinner could be served.
That's so bleak. And if a household wanted to avoid the whole lead roulette of earthenware, the alternative was metal. But looking at the maintenance required for early metallurgy, that really wasn't much better.
No, it had its own nightmares.
Iron was incredibly heavy and required constant seasoning with unsalted animal fat or paraffin wax just to prevent it from rusting into oblivion. And copper, which is prized by chefs today, had its own toxic properties.
Right. Copper is a brilliant thermal conductor, which is why it was highly sought after. But bare copper reacts violently with acidic foods, producing copper salts, commonly known as verdigris, and those are highly toxic and cause severe gastrointestinal illness.
So you're trading neurotoxins for severe stomach sickness.
Basically. To safely cook with copper, the interior of the pot had to be meticulously lined with a very thin layer of tin.
Which introduces a completely new chore, right? Because tin has a low melting point and it wears away if you scrape it.
The tin lining degraded constantly, so a kitchen actually relied on the regular visits of traveling tinkers to recoat the interiors of their cookware. It was just this endless cycle of exhaustive maintenance. The true liberation of the kitchen didn't occur until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven by the democratization of aluminum.
The aluminum age.
Yes. Once the Hall-Héroult process made it commercially viable to extract aluminum from bauxite ore, the kitchen was transformed entirely. Aluminum provided high thermal conductivity, it resisted corrosion without the need to slather it in animal fat, and it had remarkably low toxicity. It fundamentally reduced the physical labor required merely to maintain the tools of survival.
Which brings up this concept of physical labor. And that leads us to one of the most compelling sociological theories in our source material, the labor-saving paradox.
This is a brilliant concept.
It really stuck with me, because the 19th century witnessed an absolute explosion of patented domestic gadgets. Mechanical apple cores, rotary egg beaters, early hand-cranked dishwashers. On the surface, this looks like a utopian era where technology is finally freeing humanity from domestic drudgery.
Right, but to dismantle that utopian illusion, we have to examine the work of the French cultural historian Daniel Roche. He wrote extensively on what he called the birth of consumption.
Okay, what does he mean by that?
Roche observed a profound shift in the psychological relationship between humans and objects. For the vast majority of agrarian history, everyday items were heirlooms. A cast-iron cauldron was a major asset passed from a grandmother down to a granddaughter. The modern concept of continually acquiring novel, specialized items was entirely alien.
But then the Industrial Revolution completely shatters that model. Suddenly you have Sears Roebuck catalogs offering hundreds of mass-produced, specialized gadgets promising to save you time.
Exactly. And the proliferation of these gadgets created a new dynamic, fulfilling a warning issued by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau a century earlier.
What was the warning?
Rousseau argued that as humanity acquires new conveniences, those conveniences rapidly degenerate into absolute necessities, ultimately turning humans into the prisoners of objects.
Prisoners of objects.
Yes. The great irony of the 19th century influx of labor-saving kitchen tools is that they did not result in a net reduction of domestic labor.
And I found this mechanism absolutely fascinating in the reading. If a mechanical rotary beater allows a cook to whip egg whites in 5 minutes instead of 30 minutes, basic math suggests she just gained 25 minutes of leisure time. But that isn't what happens at all.
The math fails because it ignores the elasticity of societal expectations. Let's look at the preparation of a standard middle-class dinner in 1850. The expectation might be a hearty, single-pot stew and a loaf of bread, which took, say, 3 hours of intensive labor. Now, introduce the new suite of mechanical peelers, corers, and beaters. That same stew can be prepped in a fraction of the time. However, society does not grant the cook that salvage time as leisure.
Of course not.
Instead, the baseline expectation for what constitutes a respectable family meal is artificially inflated.
The standard shifts. The family no longer accepts just the stew. Now they expect the stew, accompanied by a perfectly aerated cheese souffle, a side of julienne vegetables, and a beautifully cored, intricately lattice-crusted apple tart for dessert.
The time saved by the mechanical efficiency of the tool is immediately absorbed by the increased complexity of the menu. The gadgets merely raise the floor of domestic expectation, locking the user into producing a much higher volume of culinary output in the exact same 3-hour window. The labor wasn't saved, it was just reallocated into performative complexity.
The parallel to modern professional life is staggering here. I mean, we are living through the exact same labor-saving paradox right now with software. We purchase massive suites of productivity applications. We implement artificial intelligence to draft our emails. We use automated algorithms to sort our calendars and expedite our workflows.
It's the same pattern.
Exactly. The promise of the digital age was a 15-hour work week. Yet, nobody feels like they possess more free time. The baseline expectation has simply shifted so that an individual employee is now expected to generate the output of 3 people.
The software operates identically to the mechanical apple corer. The tools engineered to serve us inevitably alter the systemic expectations placed upon us. The efficiency doesn't liberate the worker, it simply amplifies the quota.
Yeah, we've seen how technological intervention in the kitchen raised our societal baseline for domestic labor. But that principle of hidden expectations doesn't stop at the dining room table. The semiotics of labor and status are literally stitched into the garments we wear.
Oh, absolutely. Clothing is incredibly communicative.
Moving from the kitchen to the closet. The historical baggage attached to our everyday clothing is astonishing, particularly when we examine objects that have undergone a complete inversion of meaning. And there's no better example of this than the high heel.
The high heel is the perfect case study. If you ask anyone today to define the high heel, they will categorize it as the ultimate symbol of traditional, formal women's fashion. It's often associated with the deliberate restriction of mobility in exchange for aesthetic appeal.
Right.
But the origin of the raised heel has absolutely nothing to do with European femininity or aesthetic restriction. It was engineered as a piece of tactical military hardware.
The Persian cavalry.
Yes. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the Persian cavalry was unmatched, and they were heavily reliant on mounted archers. Biomechanically, if a soldier riding a horse needs to stand up in the stirrups to stabilize his core and draw a bow with maximum tension, a flat-soled shoe is a massive liability.
Your foot would just slip right through.
It will slip straight through the stirrup, so the pronounced block heel was engineered specifically to hook onto the stirrup, locking the rider's lower body in place and providing a stable firing platform at a full gallop.
So the high heel was essentially the medieval equivalent of a sniper's bipod. It was deadly, highly functional combat gear. So how does that object transition from the deserts of Persia to the ballrooms of France?
The transmission occurs through diplomacy. At the end of the 16th century, Shah Abbas I of Persia dispatched these diplomatic missions to European courts to forge alliances against the Ottoman Empire. The Persian diplomats arrived in Europe wearing their traditional equestrian attire, which included the pronounced heels.
And the Europeans noticed.
They were obsessed. The European male aristocracy was instantly captivated by the martial prowess and the exotic wealth of the Persians, and they aggressively adopted the style.
But they weren't wearing them to shoot arrows from horseback. Like King Louis XIV of France famously commissioned shoes with bright red 5-inch heels. He wasn't a cavalry archer, he was performing.
Exactly. The adoption by European monarchs is where we really must apply the sociological framework of Pierre Bourdieu, specifically his concept of cultural capital.
Okay, lay that out for us.
Bourdieu theorized that the objects we surround ourselves with are rarely purely functional. They are semiotic signifiers. They communicate an individual's status, their mastery of unspoken societal rules, and their proximity to power.
So when Louis wears the heels.
When Louis XIV wore towering red heels, the cultural capital of the shoe had shifted entirely from physical utility to conspicuous consumption. The impracticality became the point. Wearing shoes that were virtually impossible to walk in on muddy cobblestone streets signaled to the world, I am so extraordinarily wealthy that I do not have to traverse the physical world like a commoner. The world is paved for me.
It's the ultimate flex of aristocratic privilege.
Pure privilege.
But when does it become exclusively gendered toward women?
Well, in the 1630s, European women actually began adopting elements of masculine fashion. They were cutting their hair shorter, wearing military-inspired epaulets, and donning high heels. It was initially a subversive tactic to appropriate masculine power.
Oh, I love that.
But over the following century, the male heel gradually grew lower and broader as men's fashion prioritized the sobriety of the Enlightenment era, while the female heel grew higher and more ornate. Eventually, the shoe's cultural capital completely inverted.
So the exact same physical geometry, a raised block under the heel, transitioned from signifying a lethal male warrior to signaling wealthy male privilege to eventually becoming the global standard for feminine fashion.
The physical object remains totally static, but society rewrites its entire meaning.
That is wild.
Okay.
And we see that exact same mechanism of semiotic inversion happen a few centuries later, with arguably the most ubiquitous garment on the planet, blue jeans.
The trajectory of denim jeans mirrors the high heel perfectly, but it's moving in the opposite socioeconomic direction. The origin of the modern blue jean begins in 1873 with Levi Strauss, who was a dry goods merchant in San Francisco, and Jacob Davis, a tailor from Nevada. And they weren't trying to make a fashion statement. They were trying to solve a catastrophic material failure during the California gold rush.
Yeah, because the miners were engaged in some of the most grueling, destructive physical labor imaginable, and their standard trousers were literally disintegrating.
The pockets and the seams were blowing out constantly under the weight of heavy ore samples and steel mining tools. So Jacob Davis conceived this brilliant engineering solution of taking copper rivets, the exact same kind used in horse harnesses, and pounding them into the specific points of strain on thick, indigo-dyed denim fabric.
Such a smart fix.
It was. They patented the process, creating a nearly indestructible garment designed explicitly for the lowest, dirtiest, most physically punishing rung of the economic ladder.
So for over half a century, the cultural capital of denim was strictly tied to manual labor. If you were wearing jeans, you were a miner, a factory worker, or a farmer. You were sweating.
Denim was the uniform of the working class, period. The radical shift occurs post-World War II, really crystallizing in the 1950s. The post-war era birthed the modern concept of the teenager as a distinct demographic with disposable income and a deep desire to differentiate themselves from the rigid, suited conformity of their parents' generation.
And Hollywood steps in to catalyze that transition.
Hollywood was the megaphone. When actors like Marlon Brando in The Wild One and James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause appeared on screen wearing denim, they fundamentally altered the garment's cultural capital.
They weaponized the working class associations of the fabric to project this aura of rugged, anti-establishment authenticity. The denim became a deliberate middle finger to the polite white-collar society of the suburbs.
And the perceived threat of this cultural shift was so acute that in the 1950s, numerous American school districts and movie theaters actively banned the wearing of blue jeans.
They banned pants.
They did. Denim was officially classified as a sartorial marker of juvenile delinquency and moral decay.
The irony is almost too much to process. An object engineered specifically to protect men swinging pickaxes in gold mines becomes a banned symbol of teenage rebellion. And today, it has been entirely absorbed by luxury fashion. I mean, you can walk into a boutique and pay $800 for a pair of distressed jeans that you will wear while sitting perfectly motionless in an ergonomic mesh chair typing on a laptop.
It's true.
The durability of the copper rivet is completely irrelevant to the modern wearer.
It is the ultimate manifestation of Bourdieu's theories. The primary function of the zone has shifted from protecting the physical body to shielding the psychological ego.
That's a great way to put it.
Wearing denim in a modern corporate office is a semiotic broadcast that says, I am a disruptive thinker. I am not constrained by the archaic sartorial rules of the 20th century executive. You are paying a premium for the distilled cultural memory of the gold rush and the 1950s rebel, woven into a garment you wear to a marketing meeting.
Okay, looking at how these garments actually stay secure to our bodies reveals another layer of hidden engineering: fasteners. Buttons and zippers seem so elemental to clothing that it's easy to assume they have just existed forever. But the historical record regarding the button is full of surprising delays.
Archaeological evidence shows that buttons have existed for over 5,000 years. Elaborately carved shell and bone buttons have been excavated from the Indus Valley civilization.
5,000 years is a long time.
Right. However, the crucial distinction is that for millennia, these objects were purely ornamental. They were sewn onto garments as decorative appliques, functioning much like modern sequins. The engineering leap required to turn a decorative disc into a functional fastener took thousands of years.
Why did it take so long?
Primarily because of the limitations of fabric technology.
Oh, right. Because the hurdle wasn't the button. The hurdle was the hole. I was looking at the textile history, and the mechanics of woven fabric make cutting a hole in it incredibly destructive.
Precisely. If you take a piece of linen or wool woven on a traditional loom, it consists of interlocking warp and weft threads. The moment you take a knife and slice a vertical slit into that fabric, the structural integrity collapses. The threads immediately begin to fray and unravel outward.
It just falls apart.
Exactly. It wasn't until the 13th century in Europe that tailors perfected the reinforced buttonhole. That's an intricate overcasting stitch that binds the raw edges of the slit, preventing the warp and weft from disintegrating under tension.
That single tiny textile innovation, reinforcing a slit in a piece of cloth, fundamentally rewrites the history of human clothing.
It triggered a tailoring revolution. Before the buttonhole, garments had to be draped, wrapped, tied, or pinned with brooches. Clothing was inherently loose and voluminous. The functional button allowed tailors to cut fabric on the bias and construct garments that closely contoured the human anatomy.
So it allowed for fitted clothes.
Yes. It revolutionized the design of military arming doublets, allowing heavy plate armor to be secured tightly to the body, which eventually trickled down to civilian fashion, popularizing the button across all social strata.
So the button reigned supreme for centuries, but eventually the demand for speed necessitated the invention of the zipper. Though, judging by the early patent files, the zipper was an engineering nightmare.
Oh, the quest for a continuous clothing closure was fraught with mechanical failures. Elias Howe, the inventor of the sewing machine, actually patented an automatic continuous closure in 1851, but he never even marketed it.
He just gave up on it.
Pretty much. Then in the 1890s, Whitcomb Judson marketed a device called the clasp locker, which was primarily designed as a faster alternative to lacing tall boots. Judson's mechanism relied on a complicated system of hooks and eyes. It was incredibly bulky, prone to jamming, and had a terrible tendency to spontaneously pop open.
Which is the absolute worst characteristic a fastener can have.
It's really the worst.
The turning point arrives with a Swedish-American electrical engineer named Gideon Sundback in 1913.
Sundback approached the problem mathematically. He discarded the hook and eye concept entirely. He designed the separable fastener, which relied on two facing rows of identical interlocking metal scoops. His genius was increasing the density of the teeth up to 10 per inch and designing a slider that acts as a wedge, forcing the scoops to interlock tightly.
It's brilliant engineering.
The mechanism was flawless, but the garment industry was highly skeptical.
It took a rubber tire company to finally popularize it.
It did. In 1923, the B.F. Goodrich Company decided to incorporate Sundback's fastener onto a new line of rubber galoshes. They needed a catchy marketing term to describe the speed of the device, so they coined the onomatopoeic word zipper, meant to mimic the sound of the slider aggressively interlocking the metal teeth.
Zip.
Exactly. The name was so evocative that it instantly became the generic trademark for the device globally.
Much like the high heel, it seems like war was the ultimate catalyst for normalizing the zipper.
World War II accelerated its integration massively. The military recognized that zippers provided superior weatherproofing and rapid closure for aviator flight suits, sleeping bags, and naval gear compared to buttons, which could snag or freeze.
That makes total sense.
When millions of soldiers returned to the civilian workforce accustomed to the efficiency of the zipper, the garment industry was forced to adapt, and the button finally had a permanent rival.
Before we move on from the fasteners of the physical world, we absolutely have to touch upon the safety pin. Functionally, it is an evolution of the ancient Roman fibula, which was a large clasp used to secure heavy woolen togas. But the modern safety pin, with its coiled spring mechanism and shielded clasp, was invented in 1849 by an American mechanic named Walter Hunt. And his motivation wasn't to revolutionize fashion. His motivation was a minor financial panic.
Walter Hunt's story is one of the great tragedies of intellectual property. Hunt was a brilliant, prolific inventor in New York. He had previously invented a successful flax spinner and an early version of the sewing machine, but he was perpetually terrible at business.
Just bad with money.
Exactly. In 1849, he found himself owing a $15 debt to a draftsman. Desperate for quick cash, he sat at his workbench with an 8-inch piece of brass wire. Over the course of 3 hours, manipulating the metal, he engineered the modern safety pin. The coiled loop at the center provided the torsion spring, and the metal cap shielded the sharp point, preventing injury.
It is an immaculate piece of industrial design, and he just throws it all away.
He immediately patented the device, and on the exact same day, sold the patent rights outright to the draftsman he owed the money to for $400.
$400. For a design that has remained virtually unchanged for nearly 2 centuries, an object that has generated untold billions of dollars in revenue across the globe. He effectively traded the patent rights to a global stable to settle a bar tab.
He never saw a single cent of royalty from the safety pin. The object became universally indispensable, while its creator faded into historical obscurity.
The image of Walter Hunt sitting at his desk, twisting a piece of wire to solve a problem, provides the perfect thematic transition for our deep dive. Because as human civilization transitioned from the physical labor of the fields and the gold mines into the cognitive labor of the office, we required an entirely new ecosystem of tools. And the seemingly mundane items sitting on our desks carry histories that changed the velocity of human thought and, in some cases, became tools of profound political resistance. Let's examine the desk.
The foundational architecture of the modern desk is built entirely on paper. Paper is arguably the most consequential everyday object in human history because it fundamentally altered the biological limitations of the human brain.
To truly appreciate paper, we have to look at the friction of early written communication. If a scholar or a merchant in antiquity needed to record information, the available substrates were incredibly hostile.
They were awful. The options were heavy, fragile clay tablets in Mesopotamia. In Egypt, you had papyrus, which was highly regional, very brittle, and susceptible to moisture.
Not great for longevity.
Not at all. In Europe, the standard was parchment or vellum, which is manufactured by laboriously stretching, scraping, and drying the skins of calves, sheep, or goats. A single Bible required the skins of hundreds of animals.
That's incredibly resource-intensive.
It was exorbitantly expensive. Written knowledge was a luxury good guarded by the elite.
Then a massive technological leap occurs in China around 105 CE, traditionally credited to a court official named Kai Lun. And the most shocking revelation in the sources is the actual material composition of early paper, because modern consumers instinctively associate paper with deforestation and wood pulp. But wood pulp paper is a largely 19th century invention.
For almost the entirety of its history, paper was not made from trees. It was made from recycled textiles, specifically rags.
Rags.
Yes. Discarded linen clothing, hemp cords, and old fishing nets were collected, soaked in water, beaten into a slurry of individual cellulose fibers, and then sifted through a screen to dry into a cohesive sheet. The original information superhighway was built on the recycled clothing of the peasantry.
The economic ecosystem that developed around this is fascinating. The medieval rag and bone men roaming the streets of Europe, scavenging for discarded linen to feed the insatiable paper mills. There are even historians who argue that the Black Death in the 14th century indirectly fueled the printing revolution.
That's a profound connection.
Because the massive population loss resulted in a surplus of discarded clothing, which drastically lowered the price of rags, which in turn lowered the price of paper, making Gutenberg's press economically viable.
It is a profound chain of causality. But the sociological impact of cheap paper goes deeper than economics. It altered human cognition. Before the proliferation of paper, human memory was primarily internal.
You had to remember everything.
You did. The great scholars and orators of antiquity relied on complex oral traditions and mental frameworks, called memory palaces, to retain vast amounts of information. Paper allowed humanity to externalize memory. You no longer needed to dedicate massive neural resources to holding the text of a treaty or a mathematical theorem in your head. You could offload that data onto a cheap, lightweight physical substrate and just leave it on your desk.
It creates a permanent, searchable hard drive for the human species. The modern bureaucratic state, relying on complex tax codes, census records, and legal statutes, is an impossible construct without the external memory provided by paper.
Entire institutions of modern civilization are purely paper constructs. But of course, the externalization of thought inevitably leads to the externalization of error. If you are writing things down, you are going to make mistakes.
Which brings us to the eraser. And before I read the research for this deep dive, I had never given a second thought to how a mistake was corrected before the invention of the pink rubber eraser. The historical reality is almost comical. For hundreds of years, the greatest architects sketching out cathedrals, the brilliant mathematicians calculating planetary orbits, and the authors drafting early literature were essentially correcting their profound intellectual work using a sandwich.
It sounds absurd, but it is entirely accurate. Prior to the late 18th century, the global standard for removing graphite marks from parchment or paper was crustless bread.
Bread.
The draftsman would tear the crust off a loaf, take the soft, white... The gluten matrix and the residual moisture of the bread would adhere to the graphite dust and lift it from the fibers of the paper.
The mechanical inefficiency of that process is staggering, not to mention the mess of breadcrumbs scattered across an architectural schematic. Or the fact that if you look your eraser in a drawer for a week, it would cultivate a massive colony of mold.
It was a highly flawed system.
To say the least.
The paradigm shifted through pure serendipity in 1770. An English engineer and optician named Edward Nairn was working at his desk. He reached blindly for his standard piece of bread to erase a pencil mark, but accidentally picked up a small block of a novel substance that had recently been imported from South America.
What was it?
A natural, coagulated latex tapped from the Hevea brasiliensis tree.
He rubs the tree sap on the paper by mistake, and the modern eraser is born.
He immediately recognized that the latex was infinitely superior to the bread. It crumbled less, picked up graphite cleaner, and didn't rot. The action of using this new material actually dictated its English name. The renowned chemist Joseph Priestley, who discovered oxygen, observed this latex and explicitly noted that it was exceptionally adapted to the purpose of rubbing out pencil marks. Based on that physical action, the material was christened rubber.
The substance is literally named after the verb. But natural rubber was highly temperature sensitive, right? It would melt in the summer and turn brittle in the winter. It wasn't until Charles Goodyear perfected the vulcanization process in 1839, adding sulfur and heat to stabilize the polymer, that the bread eraser was permanently relegated to history.
So humanity has paper to store its thoughts and vulcanized rubber to revise them. But as bureaucracy swelled, a new mechanical problem arose. How do you temporarily bind these external thoughts together without destroying the paper?
Before the paperclip, office workers were using straight pins which punctured the documents and routinely drew blood, or they were binding stacks of paper with ribbon and wax. The invention of the paperclip seems like the ultimate triumph of elegant, minimalist design.
The paperclip is a masterclass in material science. The most ubiquitous shape, the double oval loop known as the gem design, was likely developed in Britain in the 1870s, though strangely it was never formally patented.
Really? Never patented?
Never. The genius of the gem clip lies in its exploitation of torsion and the elasticity of steel wire. It creates pressure to bind the sheets together without piercing the fibers, and its looped ends ensure it won't tear the paper when removed. But the history of the paperclip takes a dramatic turn away from office organization and into the realm of political resistance, thanks to a slightly less functional patent filed by a Norwegian.
Johan Valler.
Yes. In 1899, the Norwegian inventor Johan Valler patented a rectangular version of a paperclip. Because the gem design was never patented, Norwegians falsely celebrated Valler as the definitive inventor of the paperclip. It became an object of quiet national pride. Decades later, that obscure point of national pride was weaponized against a fascist occupation.
In 1940, Nazi Germany invades and occupies Norway, and the environment becomes incredibly oppressive.
Extremely. The Nazi regime systematically attempted to crush Norwegian cultural identity. They strictly forbade any outward displays of nationalism. Citizens were banned from wearing pins bearing the initials of their exiled King Haakon VII. They were banned from wearing the national colors. The streets were heavily policed by the Gestapo, and open defiance was met with severe, often lethal punishment.
So the Norwegian resistance needed a symbol of solidarity that could bypass fascist surveillance.
They needed something that carried deep meaning for Norwegians but was completely invisible to a German guard. They chose the paperclip.
It's so smart.
Students at Oslo University began wearing a single paperclip on their lapels, collars, or the brims of their hats. The semiotic message was brilliant in its simplicity. It just meant, we are bound together. It was a declaration of unity against the occupying force.
The tactical brilliance of it is astounding. If a Gestapo officer stops a man on the street and questions the piece of bent wire on his coat, the man can simply claim he just left the office and absent-mindedly hooked a piece of stationery to his jacket. It is encoding a rebellion into the most mundane object imaginable.
It perfectly illustrates the sociological power of the everyday object. When an authoritarian regime strips a population of grand political platforms and visible symbols, the population will repurpose the mundane. The paperclip transformed from a tool of bureaucratic organization into a profound, silent instrument of anti-fascist defiance.
That concept of unintended consequences, where an accidental discovery like the rubber erasure or a piece of bent wire turned into a political weapon reshapes history, leads us directly to the most monumental unintended consequence in the material record. We sought a substance to save the natural world from our own voracious consumption, and in doing so we accidentally engineered a material that might outlive the human species. The plastic paradox.
Plastic is unquestionably the defining material of the Anthropocene epoch. However, its origin story has been completely inverted in the modern consciousness.
We see it as pure evil now.
Right. Today, synthetic polymers are universally recognized as environmental villains. But the genesis of plastic was actually rooted in a desperate attempt at environmental conservation.
To understand the initial panic, we have to look at the mid-19th century, specifically the global billiards craze. The game was exploding in popularity across Europe and the United States, but it relied on a highly restricted, bloody resource.
The only material capable of providing the perfect density, weight, and elasticity for a high-quality billiard ball was solid ivory, harvested from the tusks of wild elephants.
Which is horrific.
The slaughter required to sustain the demand was staggering. Thousands of elephants were being decimated annually, and the ivory supply chain was collapsing. In a panic, a major New York billiards firm, Phelan & Collender, offered a massive $10,000 prize to anyone who could invent a viable synthetic substitute for ivory.
Enter an American inventor and printer named John Wesley Hyatt.
In 1869, Hyatt began experimenting with cellulose, a natural polymer derived from cotton fibers. By treating the cellulose with camphor and high heat, he successfully created celluloid. It was the first commercially viable plastic.
Wow.
The word plastic itself originally functioned as an adjective derived from the Greek plastikos, simply meaning pliable and easily shaped. Hyatt's invention was a watershed moment in human history because, for the very first time, manufacturing was no longer strictly constrained by the biological limits of nature.
Prior to celluloid, if humanity wanted to manufacture a durable object, the raw materials had to be extracted from the earth through mining, chopped down in a forest, or harvested by slaughtering an animal for its bone, horn, or tortoiseshell.
Celluloid severed that dependency. The advertisements of the era actually heralded celluloid as the savior of the elephant and the tortoise. It was viewed as a miraculous, noble substance that would emancipate the natural world from the destructive forces of human industry.
So the initial impulse is incredibly noble. But celluloid still relied on natural plant fibers. When do we transition into the fully synthetic chemical polymers that dominate today?
The true chemical threshold was crossed in 1907 by a Belgian-American chemist named Leo Baekeland. While attempting to formulate a synthetic substitute for shellac, which required the resin secreted by the Asian lac bug, he combined phenol and formaldehyde under high heat and pressure.
What did that make?
The result was Bakelite. Unlike celluloid, Bakelite was the world's first fully synthetic plastic. It contained absolutely zero molecules found in nature. It was remarkably durable, highly heat-resistant, and an exceptional electrical insulator. Baekeland marketed it aggressively as the material of 1,000 uses.
The material of 1,000 uses rapidly becomes the material of absolute necessity when the globe descends into total war. World War II acts as the ultimate catalyst for the plastics industry.
The demands of the war effort required a massive conservation of natural resources. Metal, rubber, and silk were strictly rationed for military logistics. The federal government mobilized the nascent plastics industry to fill the void.
So they swapped natural for synthetic.
Exactly. Nylon, which had been invented in 1935 as a synthetic substitute for silk hosiery, was instantly drafted into military service to manufacture parachutes, ropes, and flak jackets. Plexiglass, a transparent acrylic, replaced heavy, shatter-prone glass in the gun turrets and cockpits of bombers. Between 1939 and 1945, the production of plastics in the United States expanded by an astonishing 300%.
And when the Axis powers are defeated, that massive industrial infrastructure doesn't simply dismantle itself. The factories pivot from manufacturing bomber turrets to manufacturing the American dream.
The post-war period birthed an era of utopian abundance driven entirely by plastics. After enduring the immense scarcity and trauma of the Great Depression and a global war, the public craved affordable, modern, sanitary goods.
And plastic was the answer.
Plastic delivered on a scale never before seen. It brought Formica countertops, Tupperware containers, vinyl records, and synthetic fabrics into the middle-class home. Plastic aggressively democratized material wealth. Goods that were once fragile, expensive luxuries reserved for the elite were now practically indestructible, vibrantly colored, and cheaply available to the masses.
But the honeymoon phase is remarkably brief. By the late 1960s, the cultural perception of plastic undergoes a violent shift.
The very characteristic that made plastic miraculous, its nearly immortal resistance to biological decay, was recognized as its fatal flaw. In the 1960s, the public began noticing the accumulation of plastic debris washing up on coastlines and accumulating in landfills. This coincided with the rise of the modern environmental movement, heavily catalyzed by Rachel Carson's 1962 book Silent Spring, which exposed the unseen ecological dangers of synthetic chemicals.
The shift in cultural cachet is perfectly encapsulated in the 1968 film The Graduate. There is that incredibly famous scene where Dustin Hoffman's young, disillusioned character is pulled aside at a party by an older, wealthy businessman offering unsolicited career advice. The man leans in and says exactly one word: plastics.
And it is vital to understand that audiences in 1968 laughed out loud at that line. They cringed. Because by the late 60s, the semiotics of plastic had inverted. It no longer meant a utopian future. It had become a derogatory adjective. To call something plastic meant it was cheap, flimsy, inauthentic, and conformist. It represented the soulless, mass-produced hypercapitalism of American suburbia.
And today, that mid-century aesthetic anxiety has evolved into a full-blown existential terror. We aren't just worried about society being fake. We are observing the reality of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a vortex of microplastics twice the size of Texas. The anxiety has moved from the environment directly into human biology.
The health concerns are acute and accelerating. To make plastics flexible, transparent, or durable, the industry utilizes chemical additives like bisphenol A or BPA and phthalates.
We hear about those a lot now.
Yes. Extensive scientific research indicates that these compounds are leaching out of water bottles and food packaging directly into our bodies. These are known as endocrine-disrupting chemicals. Scientists are deeply concerned that they are interfering with human hormone systems, potentially contributing to rising rates of infertility, developmental disorders, and metabolic syndromes.
Okay, here's where I want to introduce some friction into our modern narrative. Because today, society unequivocally demonizes plastic. We ban single-use straws, we shame people for using plastic grocery bags, we actively try to scrub it from our lives. But considering the history we just unpacked, that this material was invented to save elephants from extinction, and considering that without lightweight synthetic polymers, we would not have sterile IV bags, incubators for premature infants, or the casing of the laptop I'm looking at right now, aren't we trapped in the deeply hypocritical marriage with this material? We lament its existence daily, yet modern medicine, modern computing, and modern aerospace engineering would instantly collapse without it.
That is the ultimate paradox of the Anthropocene. We are inextricably dependent on the very substance we vilify. The tragedy of plastic is not the chemistry itself. The tragedy is how human economics applied that chemistry.
What do you mean by that?
We took a miraculous, nearly immortal material capable of lasting thousands of years, and we intentionally engineered it for single-use applications. We manufactured coffee stirrers and candy wrappers out of a substance that refuses to die. We treated immortality as trash. That represents the most catastrophic design flaw of the 20th century.
We took immortality and made it a candy wrapper. That is a profoundly haunting realization. But it acts as a perfect gateway into our final suite of everyday objects. Because while plastic permanently reshaped our physical environment and our biological chemistry, our final tools reshaped something even more fundamental. They altered human perception of reality, and they fundamentally restructured our relationship with time.
To fully comprehend the modern human condition, we have to examine the mechanisms that measure and extract our time. The logical starting point is the most universally despised object in the bedroom, the alarm clock.
It is the soundtrack of modern anxiety, and its lineage stretches back much further than the industrial era.
It does. The ancient Greeks utilized the clepsydra, or water clock, which operated by allowing water to slowly drip into a vessel until a floating mechanism triggered an alarm, such as dropping a pebble onto a brass plate.
That's quite clever.
The concept of mechanized time discipline is ancient, but the first mechanical alarm clock patented in America was constructed in 1787 by a clockmaker named Levi Hutchins.
But Hutchins' clock had a massive, incredibly frustrating limitation based on his own psychology, correct?
Yes. Hutchins was a deeply disciplined individual whose personal philosophy dictated that he must awaken before the sunrise. He engineered his mechanical alarm clock to ring at exactly 4:00 a.m.
Just 4:00 a.m.
Only 4:00 a.m. He never implemented a mechanism to adjust the time, nor did he ever patent the device for mass production. It was an alarm clock that could only ever subject its user to a 4:00 a.m. wake-up call.
A clock that only rings at 4 a.m. feels like a cursed artifact. But eventually, timekeeping transitions from the nightstand directly onto the body, the wristwatch. And the history of the wristwatch reveals a fascinating gender dynamic, because for a long time, men absolutely refuse to wear them.
Throughout the entirety of the 19th century, the wristwatch was rigidly categorized as an exclusive piece of women's jewelry. It was considered a delicate, decorative bracelet. The masculine standard was the pocket watch, secured to a waistcoat with a heavy gold or silver chain.
So a wristwatch was taboo for men.
For a man to strap a delicate timepiece to his wrist was viewed as incredibly fragile and overtly feminine.
What forces the cultural shift that makes the wristwatch acceptable for men?
Once again, it is the brutal pragmatism of war. Specifically, the trench warfare of World War I. The tactics of the First World War relied heavily on precisely synchronized artillery barrages, known as rolling barrages, where infantry advanced directly behind a creeping wall of artillery fire. Timing was a matter of life and death.
Right, seconds mattered.
Soldiers in the muddy, chaotic trenches quickly realized that unbuttoning a heavy wool greatcoat to fumble for a pocket watch was dangerously slow.
So they began strapping the pocket watches to their wrists using leather bands.
They improvised. They soldered wire lugs onto pocket watches, strapped them to their wrists, and added metal grills over the glass to protect against shrapnel. These became known as trench watches. Aviators adopted the exact same tactic, allowing them to calculate fuel consumption and flight times without removing their hands from the aircraft controls.
And because these men were performing the ultimate acts of culturally sanctioned masculinity, fighting a global war in the trenches, the gendered stigma of the wristwatch evaporated.
Completely. When millions of veterans returned home wearing wristwatches, the perception shifted overnight from fragile feminine jewelry to rugged, tactical military gear. The wristwatch rapidly became the standard tool for synchronizing the modern industrial workforce, permanently tethering the individual's biological rhythm to the corporate clock.
So the alarm clock wakes us up, the wristwatch tracks our shifts, and in the modern era, to compensate for the fact that we sit at desks all day staring at screens, we try to reclaim our physical vitality by hopping on a treadmill. But I'd always joke that the treadmill felt like a medieval torture device. Looking at the historical blueprints, it turns out that wasn't a joke at all.
Your suspicion was entirely historically accurate. The treadmill was not invented as a tool for cardiovascular health. In 1818, a British civil engineer named Sir William Cubitt invented the treadwheel explicitly as an instrument of penal discipline for the British prison system.
It was engineered to inflict suffering.
It was a tool of punitive labor. Following the Vagrancy Act, British prisons were overflowing, and reformers wanted a method to discipline inmates that didn't involve the death penalty or torture, but still inflicted severe exhaustion. Cubitt's design was essentially a massive, wide cylinder fitted with stepping blades around the exterior. Prisoners would hold onto an overhead handrail and climb the infinite staircase.
That sounds miserable.
In some facilities, the immense kinetic energy generated by the prisoners was harnessed to pump water or grind corn, which is where the term treadmill originates.
But in other prisons, the cruelty was entirely the point.
In many of the most notorious prisons, the gears of the treadwheel were attached to nothing but heavy weights or large fans that merely generated wind resistance. The prisoners were forced to climb the equivalent of thousands of vertical feet a day, purely to grind the air. It was designed to systematically break the psychological spirit through monotonous, agonizing, ultimately pointless physical labor.
The psychological whiplash of that reality is profound. We took an 1818 British prison torture device designed to break the human spirit. We painted it matte black. We attached a high-definition touchscreen to it, and now modern professionals pay $50 a month to voluntarily subject themselves to it at the local gym.
It serves as a stark indictment of the modern condition. We have successfully engineered physical labor so completely out of our daily existence, we don't farm, we don't chop wood, we sit in ergonomic chairs, that our biology requires us to simulate the punishments of a 19th century penitentiary simply to prevent our cardiovascular systems from failing.
Which brings us, inevitably, to the apex of everyday objects. The device that is likely sitting in the pocket of the listener right now, the culmination of human invention, the smartphone.
The smartphone represents the ultimate material synthesis. It has absorbed the functions of the alarm clock, the paper, the pen, the camera, the map, the postal service, and the printing press, fusing them entirely into a single monolithic slab of glass, aluminum, and rare earth metals.
It's everything in one.
The microprocessing power contained within that slab vastly exceeds the combined computing power of the NASA mainframes that calculated the orbital mechanics of the Apollo moon landings.
But analyzing the smartphone purely as a piece of hardware misses the point entirely. It isn't just a tool, it is an environment. It has fundamentally restructured the neurology of human attention, the mechanisms of social validation, and construction of identity.
To unpack the sociological weight of the smartphone, we must rely on the framework established by the French philosopher Michel de Certeau. In 1980, he published a seminal text titled The Practice of Everyday Life. De Certeau argued against the assumption that everyday people are merely passive consumers entirely controlled by the systems around them.
De Certeau breaks the world down into a constant battle between two forces: strategies and tactics. Let's define the strategy first.
A strategy, in de Certeau's terminology, is a system or space constructed by an institution of power, a government, a city planner, or in the modern context, a Silicon Valley tech conglomerate. Strategies are designed to calculate, predict, and control behavior to extract value.
Give me an example.
The layout of a supermarket designed to force you to walk past high-margin items is a strategy. The algorithm of a social media platform, engineered by thousands of data scientists to hijack your dopamine receptors and maximize your screen time so they can serve you advertisements. That is the ultimate strategy.
So the engineers are building the strategy.
Yeah.
But Desserteau says the user fights back using tactics.
Exactly. Desserteau views the ordinary person as an active user, not a passive victim. Tactics are the spontaneous, clever, undocumented ways that individuals reappropriate these strategic systems to serve their own immediate human needs.
Right.
The tactic subverts the strategy. Desserteau used the physical layout of a city to illustrate this. A city planner might lay out a park with pristine, right-angled paved sidewalks. That is the strategy. But pedestrians, looking to save time, will consistently cut diagonally across the grass, eventually wearing down a dirt path.
The urban planners call those desire paths. The strategy wants you to walk in a rigid square, but human nature tacticalizes the space and creates a diagonal shortcut. How does that translate to the digital space of the smartphone?
The smartphone is the most intense battleground of strategies and tactics in human history. The corporations construct the rigid architecture of the applications to monetize our data, but users constantly invent tactics to subvert that architecture. When teenagers invent complex slang or utilize specific emojis to communicate ideas that bypass the platform's automated content moderation filters, that is a tactic. When users screenshot a political text and post it as a meme to circumvent algorithmic suppression, they are tacticalizing the space.
The ultimate tactic to me is the absurdity of how we utilize the hardware itself. The engineers in California built a device capable of accessing the totality of human knowledge, networking the global economy, and processing complex algorithms. And my personal tactic is utilizing a device infinitely more powerful than a 1960s supercomputer to lay in bed at 2 in the morning watching short-form videos of cats falling off furniture. We are constantly poaching on the territory of the tech giants, refusing to use the tools strictly as they were intended.
Desserteau's philosophy provides a deeply optimistic view of the human spirit. The smartphone attempts to shape our attention and extract our data, but humanity constantly breaks, bends, and remolds the digital environment to express humor, subversion, and authentic connection. We refuse to be entirely programmed.
The attempt to program humanity and humanity's constant rebellion against it seems to be the through line of everything we've explored today. We started this deep dive looking for the architecture of history, and we found it hiding in plain sight, embedded in the mundane. We saw how a Byzantine fork offended the medieval clergy because it dared to improve upon the natural human body. We saw how the caffeine in a cup of coffee terrified a British king because it catalyzed egalitarian debate. We traced the tragic irony of plastic, a miracle substance invented to save the majestic elephant, which devolved into a disposable pollutant suffocating the oceans. And we watched a brutal, spirit-breaking 19th century prison torture device seamlessly transition into the treadmill at the local fitness center.
The totality of this exploration proves that the mundane world surrounding you is, in fact, a densely packed museum of human revolution. It evokes the philosophy of the great French historian Fernand Braudel.
Remind us of his theory.
Braudel championed the concept of the longue durée, the long term. He argued that the structures of everyday material life, the specific ways we cook our food, the fasteners that hold our garments together, the devices that dictate our perception of time, these slow, invisible, tectonic forces shape human history far more deeply and permanently than any sudden political treaty or violent military campaign.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. I want you to look around the exact space you are occupying right now. Look at your desk, scan your kitchen counter, or simply feel the objects currently resting in your pockets. What completely ordinary, invisible, highly convenient object that you absolutely take for granted today will historians 500 years from now isolate in a glass display case? What object will they point to and definitively say, this was the seemingly harmless tool that ultimately caused their societal downfall? Or, perhaps more optimistically, this was the mundane object that quietly saved them from themselves.
Because the answer to that question isn't waiting to be invented in the distant future. The object that will define our era to the future is already here, resting silently in your hands.
The true architecture of human civilization isn't carved in marble monuments or mirrored halls. It's sitting right there in your junk drawer. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. You will never look at the everyday things in your life the same way again.